Welcome to our deep dive. Today, we're looking at semaglutide, but maybe not in the way you'd expect. We're not really going to get bogged down in the usual talk about calories or, cravings. Instead, we're diving into some, frankly, quite surprising insights from conversations with a man named Dan Hollis based on the source material we've been looking at.
Yeah, our goal here, our mission for this deep dive is really to map out that psychological landscape. The one that opens up when the physical noise of hunger finally dials down. What actually happens when those cravings just stop and something else starts talking?
It's fascinating, isn't it? Because
Yeah.
it really pushes past just appetite suppression. One source we looked at calls it the story beneath the weight,
Mm-hmm.
and another puts it as this powerful moment of realization.
Hmm.
It was never about the food. So we'll be looking at how semaglutide, at least as Dan Hollis describes it, isn't just a weight loss drug. It's more like a key, maybe. A key for decoding what he calls emotional amnesia.
Emotional amnesia. Yeah, like forgetting our own deeper emotional world because it's been sort of papered over by our relationship with food.
Right. So as we get into this, we're really going to explore a whole new angle
Right.
captured by this pretty provocative question. What if you weren't broken, just confused? Okay, let's really try and unpack this. Dan Hollis makes this quite startling claim. Semaglutide gives you silence, and silence gives you truth. I mean, that's not your typical ad copy, is it?
Right.
What's he actually getting at with this link between, silence and truth?
Well, it really makes you think about what's happening beyond the purely biological, right? Dan doesn't frame it as just suppressing appetite or, melting fat. He says, and this is a direct quote, it gives you a moment where food stops talking.
Yeah.
He adds. And for some people, that's the first honest moment they've had in 20 years.
Wow. 20 years.
Yeah. So it's less about tight control and more about what he terms intentional surrender.
Intentional surrender.
It's like consciously letting the medication handle the physical noise. That frees up your emotional bandwidth to actually tackle the deeper stuff.
So the real insight here isn't just, oh, I'm less hungry. It's that semaglutide creates this quiet space, like a blank canvas. And in that quiet, maybe for the first time, people can actually hear their own truths without all the food noise. Like finally getting enough quiet to hear yourself think.
Exactly. It's clearing the air.
But then, what happens if that silence, that new clarity, it actually feels like too much? Dan Hollis has this really counterintuitive idea about why people might stumble right when things seem quietest. He says people relapse, not into hunger, but into confusion. Like confusion. I mean, you'd think it's just hunger coming back or, discipline slipping. What's the difference he's pointing out? Why is that so important?
Well, his point is that, and again, this is quoting him, silence scares the hell out of most folks. He suggests it feels like they've lost their favorite lie. Think about it, for many, food is this constant crutch, a way to numb things, distract from feelings or situations they don't want to face.
Right. The go-to coping mechanism.
Exactly. So when that's suddenly quieted by the medication, they're left with this void, and maybe they just don't have the tools yet to handle it. So what do? They reach for the thing they know. Cheese puffs, cheat days, chaos. It's like running back to the familiar noise, even if it's harmful, because that silence feels, well, maybe just too exposed. Too disorienting.
That actually makes a lot of sense. So the usual story about weight loss failure, is just weak willpower or cravings taking over. Dan Hollis is saying that's a fundamental misunderstanding. It's more of a reaction to losing that coping tool, that self-soothing method, not necessarily just raw physical hunger returning.
Precisely. It's the absence that's jarring.
Okay, so if the silence is potentially so powerful, but also potentially so destabilizing because of this confusion, what's the solution? How does Dan Hollis suggest people should navigate this new quiet space? He talks about building scaffolding in the space semaglutide opens. What does that scaffolding actually, look like?
Is it more than just a nice metaphor?
Oh, it's much more concrete than just a metaphor. What's interesting is that this scaffolding he talks about isn't your typical diet plans or exercise routines. No, it's described as these foundational building blocks: framework, identity, ritual, language.
Okay.
It's about constructing inner architecture.
Inner architecture. I like that.
Yeah. So framework, for instance, that might mean setting up totally new ways to make decisions that aren't centered on food. Identity is huge, figuring out who you are beyond your weight or your relationship with food. Ritual means building new healthy habits to consciously replace the old ones. And language is key, finding new words, new ways to express feelings and needs instead of, reaching for the snacks as a substitute for words.
It's basically about building structure and meaning consciously, where before, maybe food was just automatically filling that gap.
That definitely paints a picture, building internal architecture.
Yeah.
It connects right back to his idea that it's not just about weight. It's about rewriting the story people were too full to finish. So, for someone who's maybe spent a lifetime with certain habits, this scaffolding gives them,
Yeah.
well, new tools, right?
Yeah.
A new blueprint to build a different self in that quiet space.
Exactly. A blueprint for change.
Now, here's another one of Dan Hollis's insights that really stood out to me. Weight loss is biology. Staying there is narrative. What does that actually mean for someone post-weight loss? Especially with everything we've just discussed, it sounds like. Like the real work, the lasting change, only starts after the weight is off.
Yeah, it really shifts the focus, doesn't it? It asks what actually makes change stick long term. And this connects to a concept Dan introduces, identity grief.
Identity.
Yes. He's quoted saying, "The weight came off, then I realized I had no idea who I was without it." And that's the absolutely crucial psychological piece that's just missing from the usual ads and, those before and after reels.
Right, you never see that part.
Never. People can identify so strongly with being the person who struggles with weight or with all the roles food plays, comfort, coping, socializing, that when that identity shifts, even for the better, there's this unexpected sense of, loss. A vacuum.
The vacuum.
Yeah, maybe you feel lost in social situations where food was always the focus. Or you struggle to create new internal stories once the old one tied to weight is gone. It's this silent, often completely unacknowledged aftermath of weight loss.
And it suggests that hunger, it doesn't just disappear entirely. He says it shapeshifts.
That's the word he uses, yeah.
It shapeshifts into memory, confusion, and this space. So it's still present, just in a different form. And that form needs a different kind of response, beyond just eat less, move more. It demands a psychological toolkit.
Absolutely, and that's precisely why Dan Hollis argues that support isn't optional, it's neurobiological scaffolding.
Neurobiological scaffolding.
Yes, because the silent semaglutide creates, it can actually be risky if you don't navigate it carefully. As he puts it, in that quiet, the stories we've buried tend to rise.
Right. The things you've maybe been avoiding.
Exactly. And without some guidance, some kind of framework, those buried stories can just overwhelm you, sending you right back to the old patterns. Our brains, our neurobiology, literally need new pathways, new connections to handle this sudden change in how we cope. That's the scaffolding.
That's such a different way of looking at it. It really means that when the cravings stop, the truth begins. That's the starting line for the real work, isn't it? The moment you stop needing food to explain your feelings. It becomes about facing those core issues, those buried stories head on, not just managing the physical side. It sounds like a call to some pretty profound self-discovery.
It absolutely is. And he's clear he doesn't promise comfort in this process. Some facing truths can be really uncomfortable, but he promises clarity. And often, clarity is much more valuable in the long run. He gives this warning. Biology will give you results that psychology will dismantle if that narrative work isn't done.
Wow, that's powerful. Biology gives results, psychology dismantles.
Right. It highlights why he stresses building language around feelings, creating that emotional scaffolding, making new narrative memories. Because the physical changes alone, they just are enough to overwrite those deep psychological patterns.
Which brings us back to Dan's sort of ultimate vision for what this journey is really about. He says, this journey isn't about eating less. It's about living more. It's about building a fuller life, a stronger sense of who you are, a future that isn't constantly defined by that internal battle with food.
Living more, not just weighing less.
Exactly. So what we've really uncovered today, looking through these insights from Dan Hollis, is that the whole conversation around semaglutide, maybe weight management, generally, it needs a pretty dramatic shift, doesn't it?
It seems so.
It's not just about the medicine, the biological effect. It's this profound invitation, almost a psychological invitation to face some deeper truths. Truths may be hidden by the noise of hunger for years.
Yeah, this deep dive really suggests the physical changes, the ones people focus on. They're just the beginning. They're like the prelude to a much bigger inner journey, a journey of rewriting your own story and really understanding that silence that opens up when the food noise finally quiets down.
So if Dan Hollis is right, if it was never about the food, and if only story can change your future, the question left for you, the listener, is, what new story will you start writing in those quiet spaces in your own life?